scientific method. I mean, I guess basically, maybe first thing we should do, cover off essentially what it is for people who aren't so familiar. So the idea is you would have, you've got a hypothesis, an idea, and you want to test whether that idea is true or not. And to come up with that, you will come up with a test, and you'll come up with a control group and a test group. And the control group will sort of just be normal people, normal things without any influence. And in the test group, you apply a certain circumstances to them, see what the effect is, and you see if that backs up your idea or not. And from that, you can form more general ideas about the way the world works.
That sounds like a very good explanation of what essentially scientific method is.
I've probably butchered it a little bit, but just to make just to sort of lay down the groundwork of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
and I mean, I guess also the basic benefits of it. It just improves things. It makes things more accurate, and it makes things more effective.
Yeah. In theory, that's what it sets out to do.
And I always thought it was something that, for a competitive sport, irrelevant of whether it's martial arts or not, it's almost necessary. You have a goal in mind. You have something you need to achieve. You have an idea about how to achieve it. What you ought to do is come up with a method to test whether you're achieving that or not.
Yeah.
And MMA could cover off that, and it might sound like people are doing it, but actually it's done really poorly, because what tends to happen is you do two things. Firstly, you'll look at the people who are successful and you'll say, what are they doing?
Yes.
And from that, you'll say, that's what got them there.
Yeah.
And the reason
that's essentially your hypothesis.
Yeah. And the trouble, that's the trouble, isn't it? There's no test.
Yeah.
It's kind of missing out a step in the scientific process. What you're doing is you're going, here's my hypothesis. This person's a champion because of this.
Yes.
And then
but you only have one group. The population of your study is one.
Yeah, or even if it's multiple people, the issue is that the whole concept of correlation does not imply causation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's loads of problems with this. So just because all the champions cut massive amounts of weight does not mean that cutting massive amounts of weight will make you a champion.
Yeah.
There's a few troubling points in MMA, and that's one of them. It's the fact that I guess our first problem is sample sizes.
Mm-hmm.
Because MMA is not a super popular sport in any case.
No, I mean, this is the thing. Like in other sports, you have many more amateurs, and even pretty high level amateurs. But in MMA, that's just not really the case. You only really have people who want to be pro. And even then, the people who are doing that, as you say, the population of that is not so large.
Yeah, and not only that, but what you really want to look at is, the goal is to have high achievement, right? The goal is to have really high level performance in fights.
Yeah.
The sample size of the MMA in general is actually pretty small in the grand scheme of things. The sample size of really high performers, it's even smaller. In a sport where if you pick a slightly niche, say women's weight, or even heavyweight fights, the sample sizes are so small that there's such a vast difference between the best in the world and the guy who's 10 below it. Yeah. There's a huge difference. And it's purely because the sample size is so small, you don't get the gradient that you need.
Yeah, agreed.
So the first problem in MMA is sample sizing and the fact that correlation does not imply causation. And just because a champion does something, or just because multiple champions do things, doesn't mean that they're champions for that reason. And that second point, okay, the sample size is something you can't get away from, but the correlation and causation part, that's something we can definitely move away from.
Yeah.
And definitely improve on.
Yeah. It's I mean, the issue is that, I mean, the complexities in MMA are definitely more prominent than some of the more mainstream combat sports.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, things like weights, I guess, weight classes, I guess that you get that across other combat sports. But then there are so many, so the all the other factors like the different types of movements you can do, then actually do play a role based on your weight, right? It's so like even across the weight classes, the types of movements you do have perhaps some sort of effect. So that adds another layer of complexity
It's
to the
different weights and different body shapes. You can do all sorts of different things with it. And I guess that touches on the next point. Oh, you go ahead.
Yeah, and but you don't really have that perhaps in some of the other sports, where the movement is much more restricted to one dimension or fewer dimensions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think that's the problem with MMA. Well, the next problem then is the level of freedom you have in, you know, you've got a huge range of body sizes and you've got a huge range of things you can do, from striking to grappling to incorporating aspects of both of those, and everything in between, wall walking, the sort of effects on the cage, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you extrapolate that to the, you know, scientific model, what you're trying to do with each of those tests is knuckle down on a specific constrained variable.
Yeah.
It's extremely hard to identify that single variable between any two fights, let alone more than that, because there are so many things that factor into it. Those degrees of freedom
absolutely
screw it all up. They ruin any sort of concept of a control group that you could have. Because I don't know if anyone ever goes into a fight feeling the same way each time. Each time you fight, you're different.
Well, that's absolutely right, and I think, but that's perhaps it's a broad simplification, but just like in scientific method, you sometimes find some simplifications in order to begin some sort of work into pinning down those variables that you've talked about, and perhaps we can. So if we started to take away, for example, how you feel on a specific day, and maybe just, for example, you look at just the training part of it, right? So things that happen before you get to let's say the week of the fight. So you can maybe you start pinning it down to you start off a bit smaller and then perhaps expand. That's the way I would see it happen. Otherwise, yeah, like the complexity of things, you know, the fact that there's a mental game going on in fighting that is so prominent, and perhaps less prominent in other sports, and that's difficult to obviously get rid of when you're trying to pin down things that make a fighter successful. But I think you probably have to start looking at the training side of things first, and then move on from there, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, of course. But and I guess it's not to say that you can't do the scientific method because there are so many variables. I mean, there are other
No,
things
that's true
studied
as well.
where there's a huge number of variables. It just makes it harder, and you need a bigger sample size, and you need to be able to account for those different aspects, or at least have a sample size large enough that those aspects sort of disappear into the background.
Yeah, I mean, statistical analysis can be applied to really anything and pretty much of most complexities, but you need a good sample size. That's the issue.
So yeah, we just need to get more people into MMA just so we can actually study it properly. That's probably a good thing.
Yeah,
But
sure.
it's also the fact that you can't. You have to do it as studies of large groups because you can't. It's hard to send a fighter in there to test a specific hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's hard to throw someone in there to say, don't throw your jab and we'll see how it works. You can't convince one person to do that, let alone, however many hundred you need to implement a proper study on that.
Mm-hmm.
You can't control people in that way in fighting because everyone's got their own objective in doing it. And everyone's changing it every time because they keep looking at champions and what they're doing and keep looking at what other people's success is in and then mimicking that. And it's not to say that's the wrong thing to do in order to get better, but it doesn't make it very easy to study.
No. But I mean, I think to an extent, yes, it's not a wrong thing to do to copy fighters, but that's the issue. It's such a individual thing. Like you always, if you try and copy someone, I think eventually you probably will end up finding what your own strengths are, and you try and play to those.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most fighters that get to the level of success that champions get to, they probably have to get into that. They have to see what it is that makes them tick and what makes them show up on that day successful, rather than perhaps copying someone else.
I'll tell you
I think that's
I'll tell you part of the trouble though is that you look at fighters who are successful and fighters who turn up on the day and what got them there, and that's most of the time all that anyone looks at, and that's a massive what's it called, sort of a feedback bias, where you look, people are never looking at the people who are failing, right?
Yes.
So let's go back to the weight cutting thing again. Let's say you look at all the champions and you say, hey, look, most of the champions cut massive amounts of weight. Therefore, that's an indicator for success.
Mm-hmm.
Does everyone look at the failures? Do the failures also cut massive amounts of weight? Do they cut more weight, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. And that could potentially destroy that hypothesis. And so it's...
But it's not a hypothesis that tends to get... People don't tend to test it in those ways, especially not in MMA, because, I don't want to be rude to most fighters, but they're not... A lot of people in this sport aren't the smartest, if I'm honest.
Yes.
Whether that's because they weren't smart to start off with, or because they've been hit in the head so many times that they aren't that smart. I
think a lot of them also they end up, they just don't have the education, right? Like a lot of them have just been athletic and perhaps played more to those strengths and didn't have the opportunity or didn't want to get into those intricacies like science.
Yeah, well, there's that. You might be playing to your athletic preferences, but it's also the fact that MMA is actually a very good thing for people in more impoverished backgrounds to give them an opportunity to
Yes.
try and make money. And that's a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
And these people might then be intelligent. They're just not from the right background where they've had the right education to know those sorts of methods. Again, it's not
Yeah.
everyone, but you know, people
Yeah, I
who've
think the sport, as a general, the sport has definitely had history of just winging it for the longest time.
yeah.
Let's be honest. I mean, I think as the sport progresses and it becomes more lucrative and you get all these huge deals like UFC and ESPN, then people start looking more into it, and looking at the actual science of some of its elements. Like, for example, the big thing we've already talked about, like damage, is
Mm.
definitely something that has become way more prominent in the recent time. And I think that is due to science.
Yeah, well, I guess you are already starting to see that change. I mean, historically, it's been the case that not only are these people not trained when they come into the sport to look at it scientifically, it's not been very lucrative or honestly very fulfilling for scientists to move into the sport. Those who do move
Mm,
into the sport love it, and it's a very niche combination of interests between
yeah.
science and cage fighting, which again is a very young sport and hasn't had enough time to be studied. However,
Yeah.
it's growing so much, you are starting to see that change. And I guess the big one is the Performance Institute.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
have you heard about like the data they collect? They're just looking at body shapes, bone densities, things like that, and correlating it to who's got the right conditioning, who's got the right power, who can hit the hardest.
Hmm.
Um, and finally, someone's collecting enough data to firstly form some correlations,
Hmm.
um, and then maybe afterwards to test causation between them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's like for an organization like the UFC, it's in their interest to try and make fighters better, right? Like try and also make them more durable or more have their career, extended.
Mm-hmm.
Potential. I mean, yeah, you could argue whether that's true or not, whether it is in their interest or not. In my opinion, it is. So it makes sense that they are making these moves. But I also think then, like you said, because the sport is getting bigger, you are getting people more interested in it, and people coming from a sports science background, they're seeing the sport and they probably have now grown up with it a little bit, and they're seeing it as an exciting opportunity for their career, perhaps. Um, so, and it definitely is an interesting area. It's a very interesting sport to study because I think it brings those interesting complexities.
Yeah, I agree, and I guess that's the sort of other end of it. Whereas the UFC and the Performance Institute is from the top down, the organization level, looking at all of its fighters and getting resources that way. The other way that you're getting it is
Hmm.
people from sort of almost like grassroots ideas. You're getting people who are highly educated and interested in the sport, then looking at using data that is now available to everyone because of the internet, gathering it and applying their own science to that. Um, it's people like School of Grappling are doing that sort of thing. Now that's a super interesting page because they have a few different points. They do things like concepts of learning martial arts, but some of those popular posts are the stuff taken from ADCC and the ADCC
Mm.
stats on takedowns and on submissions, and they break it down into like the most popular ones every in the different trials, and you can check it over the different years and see the different trends in, say, leg locks. Um, and that's an interesting one. It's just the way it's just one guy gathering a colossal amount of data and uh, amalgamizing it into one easy to digest just an easy to digest piece for people to read, which may then inspire more people to do the same. And I believe the guy who's done it is, I want to say he's got a PhD in physics. I want to say he's actually a physicist. It's super interesting that this is his thing on the side to look at.
Well, the grapple page.
Yeah, School of Grappling. Yeah.
Yeah, this is what I mean. Like, you get people now who are really interested in the sport and still, like we've already talked in the first ever podcast episode, you get different people from different backgrounds, like in the sport. So, no, but so do you think we have anyone right now in the sport who potentially is trying to apply that scientific method?
Well, I don't think it should be up to the individual athletes to apply that. I don't think that. It's more up to sort of coaches, I guess, but mostly it is. I don't think, maybe not even up to coaches. I think it's the right people at the moment. People like School of Grappling. I want to say it is Daniel Bolelli. I want to check that though, if it is him or not. But it's people like that should be doing those studies from the ground level up.
Yeah.
And then coaches should be looking at that data and applying it in their own coaching, and athletes should then listen to their coaches and maybe do their own research. But I don't think there needs to be any sort of athlete in the sport doing it. They need to then take on the information from elsewhere. Again, a lot of these athletes are there because they've not got that high level of education, or because for whatever reason. I don't think it should be expected of those sorts of people to, they are trying to be excellent at their craft.
No, I agree.
Someone else can do the studies.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I think there are some, coaches now, you see it in the strength conditioning side of things in the UFC, who are, or just generally MMA, it doesn't have to be UFC, but one guy comes to mind is like Phil Daru from ATT, but he's one of many, I'm sure. He's just the one that is quite famous. And he tends to, I don't know whether what he does is applying a scientific method to how he trains the fighters.
No, I'm not sure it is, but he's a high, as far as I can tell, he's quite highly trained in a sort of traditional sense for sports science.
Yeah, exactly. So like the principles that he applies are, they do come from a sports science source. But that's strength and conditioning, right? So that's it's a small element of what the sport is.
Yes, it is. But again, I think that's where it needs to start from. Some people are going to do the technique stuff, and some people are going to do the strength and conditioning, and it'll take a long time and not really anything. It's just going to take an amalgamation of information before those two parts are completely linked up. It's just going to require people from different backgrounds and different interests, like medicine side, such as Dr. Kickass is a great page on Instagram that applies some really some actual medical education and then applies it to MMA. Combination between that, people like Phil Daru with their sports science background, not necessarily conducting studies himself, but
but I think he does collaborate with. I've seen him go to a university to try and perhaps do some studies on himself.
Oh well, that might
maybe. But you need those sorts of people. I'm sure there are many universities who are willing to collaborate and get these studies out there, especially as the sport becomes it's becoming even more prominent. It will be an interesting case for a university to conduct those studies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about it becoming more prominent. It's about the fact that how we talked about why is MMA hated and loved? It's the fact that it's now becoming more accepted as a legitimate sport and as a sort of really viable interest. It's now becoming more acceptable for universities and things like that to do studies into it, and it's probably why you've got a lot more people from a much wider range of backgrounds coming into the sport, and that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, agreed.
So as it becomes more popular and you increase the sample sizes, you increase the length of time that it's being studied for, you increase the money and the resources that are being pumped in for people like, so that things like the Performance Institute happen, and they can gather all that data and perform interesting studies. And also the fact that it becomes more socially acceptable and people from a wider range of backgrounds become more and more interested in it, I think you're only going to see the sort of scientific application to MMA improve, and the sport will improve as a result.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please consider subscribing to the podcast and checking us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram under the name Combat Thoughts. We'll see you next time.